Sweat stung his eyes. Bone cracked under heavy knuckles, echoing through the sterile training hall. Nobody intervened. They just watched the kid get dismantled piece by piece. That was the rule here, survival of the biggest. Until a pair of worn combat boots stepped over the threshold. Adam hit the floor again. The impact drove the air from his lungs in a sharp, wet gasp. He rolled onto his side, clutching his ribs, tasting copper and old athletic tape. The synthetic mats beneath him were cold, slick with his own sweat and saliva. He tried to push himself up. His arms shook. His elbows gave out. Above him loomed Garrett. Garrett wasn't human. He was a heavy-world conscript, standing 7.5 feet tall with a torso like a concrete pillar. Thick, grey dermal plating covered his shoulders and knuckles. He breathed in slow, rhythmic huffs, barely winded. To Garrett, this wasn't a fight. It was demolition practice. "Get up, Adam," Garrett rumbled. The translator collar around his thick neck rendered his native guttural clicks into flat, localized English. "The timer is still running," Adam coughed, spitting a glob of red onto the grey mat. He was a comms technician. His job was calibrating orbital telemetry arrays, not trading blows in the Coalition Vanguard's meat grinder. But the Coalition mandated hand-to-hand proficiency for all fleet personnel. It didn't matter if you weighed 140 pounds, soaking wet. You fought until the instructor called it. At the edge of the sparring ring, Sergeant Clifford watched. Clifford leaned against the steel railing, a thermos of black stimulant in his hand. He was older, terrestrial, scarred and utterly indifferent. His eyes, pale and bored, tracked the one-sided slaughter with the enthusiasm of a man watching paint peel. He checked the chronometer on his datapad, took a slow sip from his thermos, and said nothing. 50 other cadets sat on the bleachers surrounding the pit. A mix of humans and heavy worlders. Some of them looked away, studying the corrugated metal ceiling. Others, mostly Garrett's crew, leaned forward with predatory grins. Nobody spoke out of turn. The Vanguard Academy was a machine designed to break the weak. If you couldn't survive a sparring session, you wouldn't survive a boarding action on the rim. That was the cynical logic they sold. The truth was simpler and uglier. Cruelty was entertaining. I said, "Get up." Garrett closed the distance, grabbing the collar of Adam's fatigue shirt. He hauled the boy to his feet. Adam's legs dangled for a second before his boots found the mat. He raised his hands, a pathetic, trembling guard. Garrett batted Adam's left arm aside and drove a fist into his abdomen. The sound was a hollow thud, like a hammer striking a melon. Adam folded in half. His eyes rolled back. He didn't even scream. There was no air left for it. He just dropped, collapsing into a heap of bruised flesh and torn fabric. "Sergeant," someone muttered from the bleachers. "He's out." Clifford didn't even look up from his pad. "Timer says he has 40 seconds. If he's breathing, he's sparring." Garrett cracked his knuckles, a sound like rocks grinding together. He looked down at Adam, who was currently trying to crawl toward the edge of the ring, his fingers sliding uselessly against the synthetic flooring. Garrett took a measured step forward and planted a heavy, plated boot squarely on the small of Adam's back. Adam went flat. A choked sob escaped his throat. "Pathetic," Garrett muttered. "You terrestrial runts. You bring nothing to the Vanguard but frail bones." Clifford took another sip of his drink. 30 seconds, Cadet Garrett. Keep him engaged." The instruction was clear. "Keep hitting him." Garrett reached down, wrapping a massive hand around the back of Adam's neck, intending to drag him up for another strike. The boy was dead weight. His face was a mess of swelling and split skin. He wasn't resisting anymore. He wasn't even conscious in any meaningful way. The primal brain had taken over, just firing signals of panic and pain. It was a Tuesday. Just another morning drill on the orbital station. Just another kid getting pushed through the thresher because the instructors couldn't be bothered to intervene. Clifford shifted his weight, tapping his fingers against his thermos, waiting for the clock to tick down so he could go to lunch. Then, the main bulkhead doors cycled open. The pneumatic hiss of the heavy gym doors cut through the ambient hum of the ventilation system. Major Rebecca Shaw walked into the room. She wasn't towering. She wore standard-issue grey fatigues, faded at the knees and elbows. A titanium brace ran up the side of her left forearm, a quiet souvenir from the siege of Tartarus. She didn't march. She didn't stomp. She simply walked, heel to toe, a measured, deliberate stride that consumed the distance across the metal floor grates. The noise in the gym began to die. It didn't happen instantly. It moved like a cold front. First, the cadets nearest the door went completely still, their posture snapping rigid. Then the silence cascaded across the bleachers. Even the heavy worlders, the massive brawlers who usually laughed at terrestrial officers, closed their mouths and lowered their eyes. Shaw reached the edge of the sparring ring. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't look at Clifford. Her eyes, pale and dead as cracked ice, locked onto Garrett. Garrett had Adam half lifted off the mat, his fist pulled back to deliver a crushing blow to the boy's ribs. He froze. The alien brain of a heavy worlder was wired for dominance. They sized up threats based on mass, armor, and aggression. By all physical metrics, the human woman standing 20 feet away was negligible. She didn't even have her sidearm. But biology is older than metrics. Garrett's sensory pits flared. His respiratory rate hitched. A sudden, violent spike of adrenaline flooded his system. But it wasn't the adrenaline of a hunter. It was the frantic, paralyzing chemical rush of prey. Shaw stopped at the edge of the mat. She didn't shout. She didn't issue a booming command. Her voice was low, carrying effortlessly through the absolute silence of the gymnasium. "Drop him." Garrett's fist trembled. He looked at Shaw, then down at the broken boy in his grip, then back at Shaw. His jaw worked, trying to form a response, trying to assert the dominance he had wielded so easily just 10 seconds prior. He was 800 pounds of muscle and dermal plating. She was a ghost in faded cotton. He couldn't move his arm forward. The human stared at him. There was no anger in her face. Anger meant loss of control. Anger meant a fight. What Shaw projected was a terrifying, absolute certainty. It was the 1,000-yard stare of a predator from a Class 9 death world who had seen the worst the galaxy had to offer and had buried it all. She looked at Garrett not as a cadet, not as a soldier, but as an obstacle. She was calculating the exact caloric expenditure to dismantle. "Major Shaw," Clifford said. His voice broke the silence, sounding thinner than he intended. He pushed himself off the railing, trying to salvage his authority in front of his class. "This is a sanctioned bout. The timer hasn't—" Shaw slowly turned her head to look at him. Clifford stopped talking. He swallowed hard. The thermos in his hand suddenly felt very heavy. "Sergeant Clifford," Shaw said. Her tone was conversational, which somehow made it worse. "Is the objective of this drill to evaluate combat readiness?" "Yes, ma'am," Clifford forced out. "Endurance under pressure." "I see." Shaw turned her gaze back to the center of the ring. "And how much pressure is required to evaluate a communications technician who has been unconscious for the last 2 minutes? Are we testing his ability to bleed on the mats?" Clifford stiffened. "He refused to concede. The rules state—" "The rules," Shaw interrupted, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave. Dictate that instructors maintain the operational viability of their cadets. You aren't training him, Clifford. You're letting him be used as a heavy bag because you're too lazy to properly structure a sparring matrix. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The contempt in her words stripped the skin off the room. Shaw stepped over the boundary line and walked onto the mat. Garrett's muscles locked up. As she closed the distance, the sheer evolutionary weight of humanity bore down on him. Humans were endurance hunters. They didn't rely on claws or chitin. They relied on an inexhaustible, terrifying pursuit. They chased things until their prey simply gave up and died. Garrett felt that history radiating from the woman approaching him. Shaw stopped 2 feet from the towering heavy worlder. She looked up, making direct eye contact. "Let go of his shirt," she said quietly. Garrett opened his hand. Adam crumpled to the mat in a heap, motionless except for the ragged, bubbling rise and fall of his chest. Garrett took a slow step backward. His eyes stayed fixed on Shaw, terrified to look away, terrified to turn his back. He bumped into the ropes and stopped, breathing heavily, entirely subdued without a single punch being thrown. Shaw knelt beside Adam. She checked his pulse, her fingers resting lightly against his bruised neck. "Harrison! David!" Shaw called out without looking over her shoulder. 2 terrestrial cadets scrambled down from the top row of the bleachers, practically falling over themselves in their haste to comply. "Get a medical stretcher down here," Shaw ordered. "Right now." "Yes, Major," David stammered, sprinting toward the emergency lockers by the bulkhead. Shaw stood up. She wiped a smudge of Adam's blood off her fingertips onto her fatigue pants. She looked across the ring at Clifford, who was now standing perfectly at attention, his thermos completely forgotten. "Sergeant," Shaw said, "this session is over." "Yes, ma'am," Clifford said instantly. "And, Sergeant?" "Ma'am!" Shaw's eyes narrowed into slits of cold iron. "If I ever walk into a training hall and see you delegating your command responsibilities to a heavy worlder's ego again, I will personally strip your rank, throw you in this ring, and see exactly how well you manage your timer. Do we understand each other?" Clifford went pale. "Crystal clear, Major." Shaw turned back to the room. 50 cadets sat in absolute silence, watching her. She didn't give them a speech. She didn't offer comfort or a scolding. She just stood there, a solitary anchor of quiet, devastating authority. Until the medics arrived. The bullies had owned the room for an hour. She took it from them with a single look. The medbay smelled of ozone, synthetic iodine, and the stale sweat of a dozen different species. Adam woke to a dull, throbbing ache radiating from his chest. The ceiling was a sterile expanse of white LED panels, humming with a frequency that vibrated right into his teeth. He tried to shift his weight. Fire laced through his ribs, stealing his breath in a sharp hiss. "Don't move, kid." A medical technician named Bennett materialized in his peripheral vision, tapping a stylus against a diagnostic tablet. He didn't look up. 3 cracked ribs, mild internal bleeding, contained by the autodoc. A concussion that would have scrambled a lesser primate. "You'll live, but you're benched for a week." Adam swallowed. His throat felt like sandpaper. "Timer," he rasped. "Did the timer run out?" Bennett paused. He finally lowered the tablet, looking at Adam with a mixture of pity and exhaustion. Major Shaw stopped the clock. "You're clear." Adam closed his eyes. The memory of the gym came rushing back in fractured, violent bursts. The heavy worlder's fists, the cold mat, the absolute certainty that nobody was going to stop the beating. He felt a hot, humiliating sting behind his eyelids and squeezed them tighter to keep the tears locked away. "Don't wallow, Adam. It's unproductive." The voice came from the foot of the bed. It was calm, devoid of sympathy, but completely lacking in malice. Adam opened his eyes to see Major Shaw standing there. She had her arms crossed over her chest. The titanium brace on her left arm caught the harsh overhead light. Bennett quickly excused himself, slipping past the privacy curtain with a muttered apology. Shaw stepped closer. She didn't offer him a chair, and she didn't look at the monitors monitoring his vitals. She looked squarely at his bruised, swollen face. "You did the math wrong today, Cadet," Shaw said. Adam tried to push himself up on his elbows. He managed 2 inches before the pain forced him back down. "Ma'am, I couldn't move him. He weighs 6 times what I do." "I am aware of Garrett's mass," Shaw replied. "He's a Valerian. Their gravity is 3 times ours. Their bone density is roughly equivalent to poured concrete. So why, in the name of the Coalition, were you trying to engage him in a standard terrestrial boxing stance?" Adam blinked, confused by the question. Sergeant Clifford said standard engagement rules applied. I had to hold the center ring. Shaw let out a slow, quiet breath. It was the sound of a woman who had spent a lifetime watching people die for stupid reasons. "Clifford is a moron," Shaw stated flatly. "He thinks the Vanguard is about turning every species into the exact same type of hammer. But you aren't a hammer, Adam. You are a scalpel, trying to chop wood." She walked to the side of the bed, leaning against the metal railing. "Heavy welders fight for dominance. It's biological. They lock horns, they trade blows, and the one left standing takes the territory. That is how their brains pass conflict. Clifford allowed Garrett to enforce that paradigm." She tapped her index finger against her temple. "But humans don't fight for dominance, Adam. We fight for survival. We are endurance hunters. We are engineers. We survive because we change the parameters of the environment until it kills the other guy for us." Adam listened, the pain in his ribs momentarily forgotten under the sheer gravity of her words. "You calibrate orbital telemetry," Shaw continued. "You track micro-debris fields traveling at relativistic speeds and chart safe vectors for battleships. You understand geometry, momentum, and predictive pathing better than anyone in that gym." She leaned down, bringing her face closer to his. Her pale eyes were intense, devoid of the predatory flash of the heavy welders, yet infinitely more dangerous. "Next week, you go back into that ring. But you don't fight Garrett's war. You fight yours. If he swings, you aren't there. If he charges, you let his own mass carry him into the boundary cables. You don't need to knock him out to win. You just need to outlast his cardio. A Valerian burns 4,000 calories an hour just existing in standard gravity. By minute 3, his lungs will be screaming for oxygen. Make him work for every inch of that mat." Adam swallowed hard. "And if he catches me again?" Shaw stood up, her expression hardening into a mask of cold resolve. "Then you make it hurt. You aim for the joints, the sensory pits, the soft tissue behind the knees. You are terrestrial. We don't have armor. We have malice. Stop fighting fair." She turned and walked toward the exit, pausing just before she pushed through the privacy curtain. "I didn't step in today to save you, Cadet," Shaw said without looking back. "I stepped in because watching an asset misuse its own capabilities offends me. Don't make me watch it again." The curtain swooshed shut. Adam was left alone with the steady, rhythmic beeping of the auto dock, staring at the ceiling. The pain in his chest was still there, sharp and unforgiving. But beneath it, buried under the bruised muscle and cracked bone, something cold and rational began to take root. The training hall was quieter than usual. It had been 8 days since Major Shaw walked through the bulkhead doors, and the ecosystem of the room had fundamentally shifted. The casual cruelty that usually permeated the sparring sessions was gone, replaced by a tense, suffocating professionalism. Sergeant Clifford stood by the equipment lockers. He wasn't drinking from his thermos. He held a data pad rigidly in both hands, his posture stiff, eyes fixed firmly on the floor grates. Major Shaw sat in the center of the bleachers. She had her boots propped up on the row in front of her, reading a tactical manifest on her screen. She looked completely relaxed, which only made everyone else in the room sweat harder. "Next rotation," Clifford barked, his voice lacking its usual abrasive edge. "Cadet Garrett, Cadet Adam." A low murmur rippled through the seated cadets. A few heads turned toward the locker room entrance. Adam walked out. He didn't look the same. The swelling on his face had gone down, leaving a patchwork of ugly yellow and purple bruises across his cheekbones and jaw. His left arm was wrapped in stiff athletic tape to support his healing ribs. He looked fragile. He looked like meat for the grinder. But as he stepped up to the edge of the mat, his eyes were different. The panic that usually clouded his vision was gone, replaced by a quiet, calculating stillness. Garrett stepped over the ropes on the opposite side. The massive heavy welder cracked his neck. The dermal plating on his shoulders shifted like tectonic plates. He looked across the ring at Adam, then shot a nervous glance up at the bleachers where Shaw sat. Shaw didn't look up from her data pad. "Standard rules," Clifford announced, sounding like he was reading from a hostage script. 3 minutes. Submissions allowed. No strikes to the back of the head. Adam stepped to the center. Garrett loomed over him, a mountain of grey muscle and hostility. "You should have stayed in the med bay terrestrial," Garrett rumbled, the translator collar catching the low, vibrating click of his vocal cords. "I will snap you in half." Adam didn't reply. He dropped his stance. He didn't put his hands up in the standard Vanguard boxing guard. Instead, he kept his arms loose, his knees bent deeply, lowering his center of gravity. He positioned himself at an angle, blading his body to present the smallest possible target. "Begin," Clifford said. Garrett lunged. He didn't bother with a jab. He went straight for a crushing, sweeping hook designed to catch Adam's ribs and hurl him across the room. Adam wasn't there. He didn't block. He didn't absorb the blow. The moment Garrett's massive shoulder twitched, Adam dropped his weight entirely, slipping beneath the tree trunk of an arm. As the swing went wide, Garrett's own immense momentum pulled him forward. Adam pivoted on his heel, tapping the back of Garrett's knee with the side of his boot. It wasn't a hard kick. It was a nudge, but it was applied precisely at the fulcrum of 800 pounds of forward motion. Garrett stumbled, his heavy boot catching on the synthetic mat. He crashed into the boundary ropes, the steel cables groaning under his weight. Silence fell over the bleachers. Garrett roared, pushing off the ropes. He spun around, his sensory pits flaring wide, searching for the smaller human. Adam was already standing 10 feet away, in the exact center of the ring, his breathing slow and steady. "Stand still!" Garrett bellowed. He charged again, closing the distance in 2 massive strides. He brought both hands down in a hammer blow. Adam stepped off the center line. The heavy fists slammed into the mat, sending a shockwave through the floorboards. Before Garrett could recover, Adam stepped in close. He didn't aim for the armor. He drove the heel of his palm upward, striking the soft, unprotected tissue right beneath Garrett's translator collar, the heavy welder equivalent of an Adam's apple. Garrett choked, a wet, hacking sound tearing from his throat. He staggered back, swatting blindly at the air. Adam retreated immediately, keeping his distance. 1 minute down. Garrett was breathing heavily now. In standard gravity, moving his mass at that speed was a thermodynamic nightmare. Sweat began to pool in the deep crevices of his grey skin. He glared at Adam, the initial arrogance replaced by a frustrated, burning fury. He lunged a 3rd time, abandoning form for raw speed. He caught Adam's shoulder, his massive fingers closing around the fabric of the fatigue shirt. Adam grimaced as the grip sent a shock of pain through his injured ribs. Garrett yanked him forward, pulling back a fist to deliver the finishing blow. Adam didn't try to pull away. He went with the momentum. Using Garrett's own pull, Adam threw his entire weight forward, leading with his skull. He drove his forehead directly into the bridge of Garrett's broad, flat nose. Bone crunched. Dark, viscous fluid erupted from Garrett's nostrils. The heavy welder roared in pain, dropping Adam to clutch at his face. Adam hit the mat, rolled, and sprang back to his feet, panting heavily. Blood trickled down his own forehead from the headbutt, stinging his eyes, but he didn't wipe it away. He kept his eyes locked on his opponent's chest, watching the rapid, erratic rise and fall of the Valerian's breathing. 2 minutes down, Garrett was a mess. His nose was broken, leaking dark fluid over his chin. His chest heaved like a bellows. He tried to step forward, but his legs were sluggish, trembling under the sheer aerobic strain of fighting a ghost. He swung a lazy, exhausted backhand. Adam simply ducked under it and shoved Garrett's hip. Off balance and exhausted, Garrett tripped over his own feet and crashed to the mat. The impact rattled the floor. He tried to push himself up, his massive arms shaking with exertion. He managed to get to one knee, gasping for air, thick strings of saliva hanging from his mouth. He looked up at Adam. Adam stood over him. The human was battered. His face was bleeding, and his posture favored his broken ribs. But he wasn't broken. He was breathing steadily, his eyes cold and mathematical, waiting for the heavy welder to make another mistake. Garrett looked at Adam, then at the timer on the wall. 10 seconds left. The Valerian let out a long, defeated breath. He stayed on one knee, refusing to stand up. He had nothing left in the tank. The terrestrial hadn't overpowered him. The terrestrial had let him defeat himself. The buzzer sounded, sharp and loud. "Time," Clifford called out. His voice held a note of genuine awe. Adam exhaled. The tension drained out of him, and the pain rushed back in a crushing wave. He stumbled backward, catching himself on the boundary ropes, gripping the top cable to stay upright. Across the room, the cadets in the bleachers sat in stunned silence. They looked at the 800-pound bruiser gasping on the floor, and then at the 140-pound comms tech leaning against the ropes. No one laughed. No one made a cynical comment. The paradigm had shifted. Major Shaw finally looked up from her datapad. She studied the ring for a long moment. She looked at Garrett's broken nose, and then she looked at Adam, who was wiping blood from his eyes with a shaking hand. Slowly, deliberately, Shaw reached over and tapped the screen of her pad, locking it. She stood up. She didn't smile. She didn't offer a round of applause or a congratulatory speech. She just gave Adam a single, subtle nod. A quiet acknowledgement from one predator to another. Then she turned and walked out through the heavy bulkhead doors, leaving the gym exactly as she preferred it. Quiet, disciplined, and painfully aware of exactly what a human could do. That's the beauty of humanity in the wider galaxy. We might not have the densest bones or the hardest armor, but we will outthink, outlast, and out-survive you every single time. If this story of asymmetrical warfare and human grit hit the mark for you, crush that like button and subscribe for more HFY sci-fi content. What's your favorite human survival tactic? Drop a comment below, and be sure to share this video with the sci-fi community. Stay grounded, everyone.